This is probably about the time you should remove this alignment tool. The space between your torque tube and the housing is going to stay at roughly, I don't know, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And no matter how much you try to close that gap, you're not going to. All right, so I'm getting ready to put the slave cylinder onto the car. Wanted to show you guys this. So typically a slave cylinder is going to come with like a little nub that screws in, and when you connect this line to your master cylinder, you have to bleed the system. When they talk about a speed bleeder, if you've ever read about a speed bleeder, that's what this is. So basically what you do, instead of having to bleed it from that nub, you basically remove that nub, just unscrew it, and then you install the speed bleeder, which is like, you know, 40 bucks maybe. But what that does is it gives you the ability to bleed the slave cylinder from a remote location, hence remote speed bleeder. The way you put this together is this thing's going to come coiled up, or at least it did for me. It has a fitting that gets screwed into the slave cylinder itself, and there's a copper washer. On my particular part, it came on this side. I had to unscrew the fitting, take the washer off, and then put it on this side. I then tightened the little fitting, and then tightened this to the fitting. The line in itself does have a little bit of a bend, and when you tighten everything, it doesn't move. So what you want to do is you want this bend to come towards you this way when you're laying the slave cylinder like this, and I'll show you guys why you want to do that. This line here does move around, so this one's not a problem, but this one, it's stationary. If it does have a bend, try to get it to come this way. So here we are underneath the car. Slave cylinder, torque tube, transmission laid out underneath the car. A couple of things to note. I already talked about the positioning of this line and this line. That becomes important. As you see here, you got these dimples. That's where these two things are going to come out of. But more importantly, when you look under here, when you bolt the torque tube assembly to the transmission, or I'm sorry, this housing here, not the transmission, the lines basically have to go that way, right? So the one line that goes to master cylinder has to go this way, because it gets connected to this guy here, and it gets tucked outside of the headers up there. And then the remote bleeder, you'll also want to, I haven't figured out where to put it yet, but you also want to route it back out this way, probably towards the wheel well, to make bleeding the master cylinder easier. This is probably about the time you should remove this alignment tool. Go ahead and do that, and don't forget to, I'm going to put some grease on this and here, very little, just so it's not metal on metal, and then try to keep this area as clean as possible. This does have grease on it, this whole entire bearing assembly, so try to keep the grease out of that. So I'll clean this up a little bit, put it together, and start putting everything together. So right now I'm putting in the torque tube into the back of the engine. There's a little bit of a finagling that you're going to have to do here. So as you have your transmission and torque tube and diff propped up, if you look here, this tunnel funnels outwards, right? Well, if you try to get this guy in, he won't clear, right? Keep in mind, you have to make sure that this conduit here is tucked up, so that's not getting caught. But I just wanted to show you guys how close this is to having to be guided into this area here. before you can push this upwards more to align it with the hole. So I'm not sure if that makes sense to you guys or not, but basically what has to happen is if you were to just try to get this up, that was my neighbor with his turbo Camaro that's super nasty. So if you try to get this up, if you try to line this guy up with this funnel, try to get it up, the shaft don't clear, obviously. So you basically have to come at it at an angle like this, get the shaft in, and then you're basically going to have to get it up to the clutch and then straighten it out and then push it in. So that's what I'm working on now. One of the things that you want to make sure you're doing is when you have the transmission and diff secured down there with the, not secured, but lifted with the jack, don't yank on the torque tube to get it closer to you, because the last thing you want to do is that to slip and fall towards you. One, for safety reasons. Two, if this is anywhere inside there and this transmission does fall all the way to the ground, it's about a foot off the ground, it could snap that shaft. So basically every single time I got to push it in this way, I come under the car, guide this upwards, hold it up with the jack stand, and then I go out and then I push the actual jack forward. And if I feel any tension whatsoever, I make sure that I stop. I look at it from the side to make sure that these wood blocks and the transmission, or the jack stand and the transmission, are all still in line to keep that center of balance. So just going to keep plugging away here, and I'll give you guys an update here shortly. The shaft is almost completely seated into the clutch and flywheel. I wanted to give you guys a quick little tip when you're doing this. I ran into this problem. So as you're moving, get my fat ass under here. As you're moving this entire assembly in, you're gonna have to lift it. As you're lifting, if you took apart the entire rear end like I did, or took down the entire rear end like I did, this thing droops. So the entire cradle that holds the rear diff and the transmission droops. So what ends up happening is, up here, as you raise, this thing gets caught on these studs. So as you're trying to push that in and line up the shaft and the splines, if this gets caught, you may have a problem there because you don't know where exactly it's caught. So what I did was I basically took a pry bar, I put it in like so, and I just gently pried downwards. And what that did was it took the entire cradle from drooping like this, straightening it out, and I took a jack stand, pinned it on my jack, and then supported that end that would be normally drooping down up. And you only have to do that the last few inches as you line this hole up with this stud, and you're putting the spline into the transmission. If that doesn't make sense as you're doing it, you're going to figure out where exactly it's getting stuck on. This was the only way I was able to figure out how to keep this entire end up and still be able to move that way, because there's really nowhere for you to jack this entire rear end, this cradle, the support up, unless you take it completely off from the end, from the transmission and the diff. And here is the spline lining up with the clutch. What I wanted to show you guys here is a little trick that I'm sure you will need unless you get super lucky. So as you're pushing this shaft in, there's like, I don't know, 20 splines, 16 splines, I don't know how many, that all have to mate together. And as I stated before this, you don't know where it's all getting caught up. So what I did was I pushed it up against the clutch, and I basically grabbed this and I was slowly pushing it up until it couldn't go anymore. And I spun the clutch and the flywheel, you know, a centimeter, and tried pushing it in. And I did that once, and it lined up perfectly to where I could just grab this here and with my other hand here and basically just scrunch it together. So I guess the point is, don't force this in. It should go in fairly simple. It's fairly easy. If it doesn't, then you need to check everywhere else where it might be getting caught. There's a lot of little areas, such as these lines, this bracket here, and the shifter assembly up there can get caught. There are these tabs that can get caught onto this lip and over here as well. So just be very, very careful. The other thing is this conduit here, make sure you continue to push it up. As you seat this, you'll eventually want to tuck it back into these brackets, but this guy here will try to stay between these two up there. It's very difficult to catch as you're focusing here. So, you know, without ruining your wiring harness, take care of that and make sure that you move it out of the area. All right, so everything's back together. I wanted to show you guys one thing that you're gonna have to pay attention to. Just get up from underneath the car here. All right, so you have two mounting points for this back carriage, whatever you want to call it. So as you push the transmission and the diff in that way, this carriage kind of droops downwards, and there's a mounting bracket or mounting bushing here around this area where the transmission sits on top of this cradle. So as you push this in and you seat this bolt here into the hole, the space between your torque tube and the housing is going to stay at roughly, I don't know, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And no matter how much you try to close that gap, you're not going to. What you need to do is you need to raise this end up. And what that does, because where the point of the transmission or bushing and bushing to the transmission and this cradle is, it acts as a pivot and essentially pushes the transmission, the diff, that way. So as you move that up and line up this hole with this stud here, the entire assembly is going to go that way. As you're doing that, you're going to have to go underneath the car, and there's two pins that are on the torque tube that are locator pins. You have to make sure that those are continue to be lined up. So you can either, if you're doing this alone, you can either jack it up once or twice and then go under, make sure that it's lining up, make sure these holes are lining up, and then continue to do that. One thing that will help, and I already talked about this, but continuing to use a pry bar very, very carefully, prying underneath the diff here and using this as leverage to tilt the entire carriage upwards to get things kind of moving around if you get stuck. If you come to a complete stop and you feel like you're hitting something, do not continue to jack up the car because your shaft might have gotten out of alignment over by the engine, or you're stuck on something over here. So take it slow, continue to check those 2 points, and you should be good.